Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to episode number 94 of International Relations This week. Under this series, every Wednesday at 8 p.m., we have been covering important geopolitical developments that have a bearing on India's national interests. These discussions are strictly from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services examination. So if you have been benefiting from this initiative, do support us by liking the video, share these videos with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's get started with episode number 94 of IR this week. First, let's take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss in today's session. We will start with the Southeast Asia region and talk about the ASEAN Summit and East Asia Summit that was held last week. This holds a great deal of significance for India, as India has prioritized its relations with the Southeast Asian countries under its Act East policy. These two groupings, that is ASEAN and East Asia Summit, they're also central to our Indo-Pacific strategy, through which India has been trying to extend its influence across the Indo-Pacific. So we shall examine this topic in complete detail. Then we shall talk about the Global Shield initiative that has been launched by the G7 countries. And we shall take a look at India-US economic relations, as the US Treasury Department has removed India from the currency monitoring list. Then we shall talk about Nirav Modi's extradition, which is likely to happen very soon from the United Kingdom. And finally, we shall move to the African Sahel region, where France has decided to end its counter-terror operations. So these are the important topics that are lined up for today. And let's start with the first topic. Last week, the ASEAN Summit and East Asia Summit was hosted by Cambodia. India actively participated in these summits. These two summits are held every year. It's an annual summit of the ASEAN countries and the members of East Asia Summit. So from India, Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar represented the country and participated at the 19th India-ASEAN Summit that provides for close interaction between India and the ASEAN countries, and also took part at the 17th East Asia Summit that allows India to interact with 17 other important countries of the Indo-Pacific region. This topic acquires all the more significance because this year, 2022, marks the 30th anniversary of India-ASEAN relations. Back in 1991, the Look East policy was launched by the then P.V. Narasimha Rao government, through which India started providing extra attention to Southeast Asia region. In 1992, India began a major outreach towards the ASEAN group to interact closely with the Southeast Asian countries. So this year marks the 30th anniversary of the India-ASEAN relations, and this year is being marked as the ASEAN-India Friendship Year. So in this context, the topic becomes very important for both prelims and as well as for mains. So first, let's talk about the ASEAN group. Let's cover the background to ASEAN. Let's talk about East Asia Summit as well. And then we shall discuss the developments that took place at the recent summit. The ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's a grouping of 10 countries, 10 important countries from the Southeast Asia region. If you look at the map, you can easily understand who are the members of ASEAN. It brings together the Southeast Asia region, which I am highlighting over here. The members include India's neighbor, Myanmar, with whom we share a land boundary and a maritime boundary. It also includes Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Brunei. These are the 10 Southeast Asian countries which are members of this important grouping, that is the ASEAN. This group was established back in 1967 through the Bangkok Declaration. It was founded by Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand by signing the Bangkok Declaration. Over the years, the other 5 countries also have joined the group, and it has become a dominant group of the Indo-Pacific region. ASEAN is essentially a political, economic, security, and cultural organization. It focuses on political and economic relations between the 10 Southeast Asian countries. It also focuses on security relations, especially maritime security relations, and also looks to promote cultural ties within Southeast Asia. So this region shares a historical connect with India. If you look at Southeast Asia, we share a civilizational link with these countries. Through religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and even Islam, we share a close religious connect with many Southeast Asian countries, be it Vietnam, be it Indonesia, be it Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia. All these countries share a historical civilizational link which is based on the strong cultural ties that we share. But post-independence, India couldn't get closer to this region because on one hand, the whole world was divided by the Cold War divide. Many countries in this region, they were aligned with the United States, with the Western powers. Few countries were aligned with the Soviet power bloc, whereas India was championing the non-aligned movement. India had taken the third path without aligning either with US or Soviet Union. And along with countries like Indonesia, we founded the non-aligned movement. So there was an ideological difference for India to get closer with some of these countries. Later, after the India-Pakistan War of 1971, when India liberated Bangladesh, India was forced to abandon non-alignment and we firmly sided with the Soviet power bloc. So again, India couldn't get closer to the countries because of the Cold War divide, as some were non-aligned, some were aligned with US, some were aligned with Soviet Union. So until 1991, the right circumstances did not exist for India to pay more attention to Southeast Asia. Also until then, Indian diplomacy was more preoccupied with its immediate neighborhood because we had pressing challenges in our neighborhood in South Asia with countries like Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, etc. And also India was more focused on the big powers like US, Soviet Union, European countries. So from 1947 to 1991, we never paid adequate attention to this critical region, even though it lied in our extended neighborhood. Even though we shared historical civilizational links with the region, Indian diplomacy hadn't paid much attention to this critical region. But in 1991, there were several developments which pushed India to launch a very important initiative under its foreign policy called the Look East policy. It was launched by the then P.V. Narasimha Rao government to account for the geopolitical changes that were happening rapidly in 1991. In 91, the Cold War divide came to an end with the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union. So now India was not bound by the Cold War ideologies. So India needed a reliable partner as India lost a close friend in the form of Soviet Union. Now India needed new diplomatic partners to back India's position at global organizations such as the United Nations. So the P.V. Narasimha Rao government started diversifying India's foreign relations, not just with Southeast Asia, but also with East Asian countries, with African countries, with Israel, with Latin American countries, etc. So the end of the Cold War and collapse of Soviet Union pushed India to reach out to new partners to find diplomatic support. And this was one reason why the Look East policy was launched, to give special attention to Southeast Asia and East Asia. Domestically as well, India had few contingencies. India was going through a major economic crisis, the BOP crisis or the balance of payments crisis. And this pushed India to introduce the LPG reforms, liberalization, privatization and globalization. So now India wanted new markets where we could export our goods. We wanted foreign investments in the form of FDI and FII to drive growth in the Indian economy. So as we entered the era of globalization, we needed new economic partners who could provide us these markets for Indian exports and bring in these investments that were much needed for India. So these domestic economic considerations also pushed India to diversify its foreign policy, and it's in this context that the Look East policy was launched in 1991. So under this initiative, India reached out to the ASEAN group, which was the central pillar of Southeast Asia, and established a sectoral dialogue in 1992. So thus began close political and economic relations between India and ASEAN countries beginning from 1992. Later, India was elevated by ASEAN and given the full dialogue partner status. ASEAN gives the status only to the closest partners like China, US, Japan. So India was placed in the same league as these close partners of ASEAN. We even became a member of a larger group called the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1996. So the focus of this initiative was to build close political and economic relations with the Southeast Asian countries, while also building security ties and cultural ties with this important region. The Look East policy would focus not just on Southeast Asia but also on East Asia. But the priority was always the Southeast Asian countries, the 10 members of the ASEAN group. In 2002, India-ASEAN started holding annual summit every year. The leaders of these countries would meet, and this has been going on from the last 20 years. So this year marks the 20th anniversary of the India-ASEAN annual summit as well. We even signed a free trade agreement with the group to boost bilateral trade. In 2010, the free trade agreement became operational for the export and import of goods between the two sides. We later extended this free trade agreement to cover services and investments as well in 2015. So these free trade agreements that covers goods, services and investments, they have boosted the bilateral trade volume between India and Southeast Asian countries. These countries have become critical economic partners for India, and today we have elevated the Look East policy to Act East policy from 2014, which has been a major policy initiative of the Modi government. Under the Act East policy, we are building upon the achievements of Look East and trying to correct the errors committed under Look East policy. So under Act East, the priority is not just on close political and economic ties, but there is priority being given for security and military relations as well. There is priority being given for cultural relations also under Act East policy. So through these initiatives, India has built close economic connections with ASEAN. We are working on various connectivity projects to bring India closer to Myanmar, Thailand and other Southeast Asian markets. We hold a lot of military exercises as well with some of these countries like Vietnam, Singapore, Myanmar, etc. So this has become a wide-ranging relationship, and it is a central pillar of India's Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, if you look at the other group, the East Asia Summit, which was established in the year 2005, this group also plays a critical role in the Indo-Pacific region. This group consists of 18 countries. There are 18 members in this important grouping, and the members are 10 ASEAN countries, the 10 Southeast Asian countries that we spoke about, and it brings together 8 dialogue partners of ASEAN. The 8 closest partners of ASEAN in the region are brought together. So in total, you have 18 countries under the East Asia Summit, which was established in the year 2005. So please focus on the members of East Asia Summit. It can be very important for your prelims. The members are the 10 Southeast Asian countries, which are members of the ASEAN group. Apart from them, the dialogue partners of ASEAN, that is India, China, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and as well as US and Russia. So in total, these 18 countries, which are the major powers of the Indo-Pacific region, they have come together to form the East Asia Summit. Since 2005, this group has been playing an important role in the Indo-Pacific, and it focuses on 6 priority areas, which includes environment and energy security, education, finance and economic relations. It also has an initiative to deal with infectious diseases, epidemics and pandemics. These countries, they also cooperate in the field of disaster management, and they extend humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to each other. They also focus on improving connectivity in the ASEAN region, as ASEAN is the central pillar of the Indo-Pacific. This group is focusing on strategic issues as well, such as counterterrorism, organized crime, money laundering, etc., which is quite rampant in the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle, which covers Myanmar, Laos and Thailand, it has become a hub of organized crime, money laundering and terrorist and insurgent activities. This deeply affects India as well. So through East Asia Summit, there is focus on tackling these security threats, and there is focus on maritime security issues as well. So India is a founding member of this group. We have been a member of East Asia Summit from 2005, and every year, immediately after ASEAN Summit, East Asia Summit also takes place. So this has been a tradition of the last 15-17 years, and India regularly participates in these two high-profile events. So that's the reason why this year's summit is of utmost importance for India. So during the India-ASEAN Summit, the two sides, along with other countries which were participating, they have spoken about major geopolitical tensions that are currently affecting global stability. They have had discussions of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the impact of tensions between Russia and US, and the Western sanctions on Russia. They've also spoken about the Cold War which has broken out between US and China, especially with regard to South China Sea conflict, the question of Taiwan. So all these key issues which are affecting global stability, which are also having an economic impact as supply chains have been disrupted due to the war and the conflict. All these issues were discussed by the countries which participated in these important summits. The Southeast Asian leaders, they have called for peace. India also has taken their side, and India has called upon Russia to work towards a ceasefire in the Ukraine conflict. India and Southeast Asian countries, they have called upon US and China as well to tone down the tensions so that we can stabilize the global world order and restore the economic balance which has been disrupted. So this was a key issue which was discussed, and apart from that, both the sides have announced many important initiatives. You should be aware of the new initiatives that India and ASEAN have announced. In the field of counterterrorism, India and ASEAN have agreed to establish a comprehensive strategic partnership and to strengthen their cooperation in fighting terrorism. So this would involve exchange of intelligence between the two sides, regular exercises as well, counter-terrorism exercises, because both the sides are affected by terrorism, which affects India and as well as Southeast Asia region. Then India-ASEAN had earlier established a science and technology fund so that they could promote joint collaboration in science and technology projects. So India has announced an additional fund of $5 million to the fund so that this initiative can focus on key areas like renewable energy and clean energy, public health, smart agriculture, etc. These are some areas which are of common interest to India and the ASEAN countries. They've also agreed to promote cooperation in the field of digital economy. As India is transitioning towards a digital economy, ASEAN countries also have a similar goal, and the two sides have agreed to focus on digital transformation of their economy, promoting digital trade, sharing digital skills, and working together in the field of innovation across areas of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, etc. They've also launched a cybersecurity initiative where both the sides can work together to protect their cyberspace, which is increasingly coming under risk as a result of cyber warfare and cyber crimes. India-ASEAN have also agreed to promote city-to-city partnerships as there is a common interest between the two sides. India has the Smart City mission through which our cities are being made resilient to deal with future risks. Through the Smart City mission, the Modi government is transforming urbanization in India, making them more resilient to deal with the challenges of urbanization by providing them better infrastructure, better amenities and facilities. ASEAN group also has a similar initiative called the Smart Cities Network, which is improving urban development across Southeast Asia. So between these two programs, India and ASEAN are looking for collaboration so both sides can learn from each other's experience. Then India ASEAN have also agreed to fast track the review of the free trade agreement, as India especially has a lot of issues with the free trade agreement which we signed in 2010 and 2015. India feels that it has been affected by the free trade agreement, as the terms of the free trade agreement is largely benefiting the Southeast Asian countries. Even though the Southeast Asian countries are very small individually, when they come together as a collective group, they become a very strong economic collective. These countries have their own inherent strength in areas like industrial production, agriculture, services, investments, etc. India has definitely improved its exports to Southeast Asia through the free trade agreement, but in certain sectors, there is a flood of cheap products from Southeast Asia which is harming India's domestic producers. For example, the coconut industry in India, especially in Kerala, has taken a hit due to cheaper coconut imports coming in from Thailand and Indonesia. The coffee industry, especially in Karnataka and other parts of India, have been hit due to cheaper coffee imports coming in from Vietnam. So India wants these trade issues to be addressed by reviewing and upgrading the FTA, and ASEAN countries had agreed to it. So now they have committed to fast track the review process and possibly upgrade the free trade agreement that specifically deals with goods, free trade in goods. They've also agreed to step up their cooperation in the field of outer space. ISRO already has a close working relationship with few Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. In these two countries, ISRO is already setting up satellite tracking stations and data processing stations. These countries would also like to make use of ISRO's facilities to launch their future rockets and satellites. So this is becoming a close area of collaboration between India and ASEAN. So in this regard, they have signed an important agreement, and they have also decided to revive tourism between India and Southeast Asia, because the pandemic has disrupted the tourist flow between both the sides. Southeast Asian countries are a preferred tourist destination for Indians. Similarly, a lot of tourists from Southeast Asia also visit India every year. But the flow of tourists has gone down in the last 2 years, mainly due to the pandemic. So both sides have agreed to revive tourism by creating better infrastructure and better connectivity. And finally, in the field of defense and security, the two sides are going to hold the first ever India-ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting in a few days on the 20th of November. This would be the first time that India's defense minister would separately interact with the defense ministers of the 10 Southeast Asian countries. This would be a follow-up to the ADMM Plus meeting, which is taking place on the 20th of November. ADMM Plus is a platform that stands for ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting. The 10 defense ministers of Southeast Asian countries plus the 8 dialogue partners of ASEAN, which are the members of East Asia Summit. These 18 defense ministers, basically the defense ministers of the countries of East Asia Summit, they all meet under ADMM Plus. It allows the 18 defense ministers to look at key security issues of Indo-Pacific. So following this summit, which is being held for many years, India-ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting will take place for the first time, where India will get to separately interact with the 10 defense ministers of ASEAN countries. And also next year, the first ever India-ASEAN maritime exercise is going to be held. This in itself is a very big development, because it allows India to establish its maritime influence across Southeast Asia region. Then talking about the East Asia Summit, the Vice President of India addressed the gathering and brought out 2 important issues which are affecting India and the world. India's Vice President specifically highlighted the challenges created in the food and energy market as a result of ongoing conflicts and tensions. As I mentioned earlier, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and also tensions with Russia and US and China, they have disrupted global supply chains. It has affected food supplies and energy supplies as well. So India has called upon the 18 countries of East Asia Summit to stabilize the food and energy market, as it is hurting the global economy. Then India has specifically pointed out to the ongoing conflict in South China Sea, where China has displayed a lot of military aggression against other Southeast Asian countries and also against Japan in the East China Sea. Here China has disputed the sovereignty of several countries. It has unilaterally claimed several islands, strategic islands for itself. And China has violated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in this regard. It has even disrupted the freedom of navigation and overflight in South China Sea and has threatened the movement of ships and aircraft belonging to other countries. So this is against international law, and hence India has called upon East Asia Summit to stabilize the South China Sea and ensure that freedom of navigation and overflight is protected in line with international law. India basically wants the rules-based order, the order which is established through international rules such as UN clause, to be protected and upheld, which is an indirect message towards China and its military aggression in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, the big initiative which was completed by India is the renovation of the Thap Rom temple in Cambodia, which shares very close historical links with India. This project has been named the Hall of Dancers project. As I explained earlier, there is a strong cultural link between India and Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, the then Khmer regime, which was a Hindu-Buddhist empire, shared a very close religious and cultural connect with the Indian civilization. I'm sure many of you would have heard about the Angkor Wat temple complex. And in this temple complex, one of them is the Thap Rom temple, which is a Hindu-Buddhist heritage. Some of the temples at the Angkor Wat site, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is associated not just with Buddhism, but also with Hinduism. Some of the temples are dedicated to Lord Vishnu, Brahma and others. So to further build upon these close cultural ties, India had announced a $4 million project to restore and renovate these cultural sites, through which Archaeological Survey of India has provided the expertise needed to restore and renovate some of these historical temples. So this project has been completed by India as part of its Look East Act East policy, and it has dedicated the Hall of Dancers initiative to Cambodia. So all these developments that have taken place shall be very, very important for your prelims and as well as for your mains. The background related to Asean and East Asia Summit, India's involvement with these groupings, and the recent developments at the summits. All these points are very, very relevant for your prelims and mains. So with this, let's move on to the next topic. We'll talk about the Global Shield Initiative, which has been launched by the G7 group of countries. The G7 is a grouping of developed industrialized nations that includes Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom and United States. The G7 traces its origin to the economic and oil crisis of 1970s, and since then it has been a major grouping of these developed industrialized nations. At the ongoing climate change summit, that is COP27, the Conference of Parties to UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is currently being held at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, G7 countries have announced a very important initiative called the Global Shield Initiative. It's an initiative sponsored by the G7 countries to help the vulnerable countries to deal with the impact of climate change. I hope you know that climate change and global warming, they have driven extreme weather events. Extreme weather events like cyclones, floods, droughts, forest fires, they've all gone up in the last few years as a direct result of climate change and global warming, which is induced by anthropogenic activities. So to help the vulnerable nations which are at the risk of being affected by these disasters, the G7 led by Germany has launched this initiative through which it will provide for insurance, immediate insurance support to the affected countries of the V20 group. With regard to climate change and global warming, there is a group called V20. It's a grouping of vulnerable countries which are likely to be the most affected by the impact of climate change, global warming, and increasing disasters. As the frequency and magnitude of extreme weather events has gone up, several poor countries, low-lying countries in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific, in South America, they are at the risk of facing the biggest impact of climate change and global warming. These small countries, poor countries, they have barely contributed to emissions. They have barely contributed to global warming. And yet they are going to face the biggest impact as a result of increasing extreme weather events. So to assist these countries, which are part of V20 group, there are 58 countries in total in this group called V20 or Vulnerable 20. It was started by the 20 most vulnerable nations, and 38 more countries have been added to this group. It has countries in South Asia and Asia as well, like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Vietnam, etc. There are many small poor countries from Africa, island nations from Indian Ocean and the Pacific, then also countries from the Caribbean and South America as well. So in total, this group, the V20 group, has 58 countries, but they have contributed just 5% of the total global emissions. But since they are small countries and low-lying nations and poor countries, they are likely to face the biggest impact of increasing disasters. So to assist them, the G7 group led by Germany has announced this initiative through which immediate insurance would be given to these countries and the victims of disasters like floods, droughts, cyclones, etc. This initiative has been primarily backed by Germany, which is currently the chair of G7. Currently, Germany is heading G7 group. It has announced a financial support of 170 million euros, and the other members will bring in 40 million euros along with countries like Denmark and Ireland, which are not part of G7. So in total, around 210 million euros are being pulled in by the G7 members and Denmark and Ireland, which happen to be one of the biggest polluters, which have primarily contributed to climate change. Since they have a responsibility with regard to historical emissions, they are trying to help out the smaller nations, the vulnerable nations, by providing them climate insurance. It will provide for immediate insurance support to the affected countries in the aftermath of a disaster. It will help out the victims of a disaster immediately after the country has been hit by a disaster. So most likely, countries like Pakistan, even though Pakistan is not part of the V20, Pakistan, which has been hit by devastating floods in the last few months, is likely to be the first beneficiary of this initiative. Along with Pakistan, Ghana, Bangladesh, Fiji, Senegal, Philippines, all these countries are going to receive climate insurance support through the Global Shield initiative. The objective of the initiative is to strengthen social protection, that is, provide insurance cover to these countries which are facing the biggest risk from climate change. So those communities which will be affected by these extreme weather events, they will be provided immediate insurance cover through this initiative. But however, there has been criticism and a lot of concerns against this initiative as well. Because at the Climate Change Convention, there was a parallel negotiation going on for a loss and damage fund, which the developed countries and industrialized nations were supposed to provide for the small and the poor countries. Since many years, at the Climate Change Convention, there is a proposal for creating a fund called the Loss and Damage Fund, so that the countries which have polluted more, which have released more emissions historically, they could contribute billions of dollars to cover for the damages that will be suffered by the small and poor countries. Now the concern is that these negotiations could be derailed, because through the Global Shield initiative, the G7 countries are promising just around 210 million euros in funding, that too insurance support, not direct financial support. On the other hand, these countries should have ideally provided billions of dollars through the Loss and Damage Fund to support the small and poor countries. Various studies conducted by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, has shown that by the end of this decade, many of these V20 countries, the vulnerable countries, will face damages to the tune of $580 billion per year. So instead of compensating them adequately, the criticism is that these countries are finding a shortcut by providing insurance support, that too for a meager sum of 200 odd million euros. So this is seen as insufficient, and the fear is that it could derail the negotiations going on at Climate Change Convention for establishing a loss and damage fund. Some of the countries are also worried that they might be expected to pay the insurance premium as well. To get the benefits of the Global Shield initiative, they might be expected to foot the bill for the insurance premium, and this could become a financial burden on these small and poor countries. So on these grounds, the initiative has faced criticism and concerns have been raised, but Germany and the other members of G7, they are branding this as a major initiative to assist the small and vulnerable countries. So that is why this development is very important, both with regard to international relations and as well as environment and ecology. Now moving on to the third topic, there has been a big development in the India-US economic relations. Since 2 years, India had been placed on the currency monitoring list of the US Treasury Department. The US Treasury Department had placed India on this list called the currency monitoring list along with few other countries. And last week, the US has decided to remove India, as India has shown some progress with regard to expectations from the US. So we need to understand what is the currency monitoring list. Why does US place a few countries on this list? What is the impact and why India has been removed from this list? See, the US, it closely observes and monitors the internal policies, the internal economic policies of its major trading partners. Those countries which have a major trading relationship with US, their internal forex policies, their monetary policy, and their foreign trade policy is closely studied by the US Treasury Department, because the US has concerns that few countries are manipulating their currency in order to enjoy a trade advantage. By manipulating currency, some of the countries which have a major trading relationship with US, apparently they are enjoying an unfair trade advantage according to the US. So US closely monitors its major trading partners. It studies their internal economic policies, monetary policies, and macroeconomic policies. And those who do not meet the criteria laid down by the US Treasury Department, they will be placed on this list called the currency monitoring list. This is a periodic report submitted by the Treasury Department of the US to the Congress. And last week, the Treasury Department has recommended to the US Congress to remove India from the list, as India has made progress. Along with India, even Mexico, Thailand, Italy, Vietnam have all been taken off the list. So now let me explain what is this list all about. What is the currency monitoring list? As I pointed out, the US believes that some of its trading partners are manipulating their currency through their economic policies and thus giving themselves a trade advantage, which is affecting US trade interests. So if the US believes that a country is manipulating its domestic currency, its own currency, to get an unfair trade advantage, then those countries are placed on this list and US labels them as a currency manipulator. Because such unfair currency manipulation gives a trade advantage, and the US views this as an unfair trade practice. It gives them an unfair trade advantage, which allows the other countries to have a big trade surplus against the US. So to identify these countries which are manipulating their currency, the US has come out with 3 criteria listed under the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015. If a major trading partner of the US meets 2 out of these 3 criteria, then the country is placed on the currency monitoring list. That is the requirement. If a major trading partner meets 2 of the 3 criteria that are listed here, then it means that the country is manipulating its currency and hence US Treasury Department places that country on the currency monitoring list. The three criteria are: if the country has a significant trade surplus with the US. If you take the total trade volume between this major trade partner and the US, and if this country enjoys a trade surplus over US, especially if the trade surplus is more than $15 billion, then the US considers this as one criteria for currency manipulation. Second criteria is if the country is having a material current account surplus, which means this country is exporting more goods to US than it is importing from the US. If the country has a surplus on the current account, on the material current account, it means this country is exporting more goods to the US than it is importing from the US. And finally, if this country is persistently carrying out a one-sided intervention in the forex market, if the country's central bank, if it is frequently intervening in the forex market, buying dollars and selling dollars to artificially manipulate its currency, then the US sees this also as one of the criteria. So if this major trade partner of US is meeting two of these criteria, two out of these three criteria, then the US declares that this trade partner is manipulating the currency for an unfair advantage and places them on the currency monitoring list. So if a country is declared as a currency manipulator by the US, it will have consequences. It could affect the capital flow into our country. It could affect the monetary policy and the forex policy of our central bank, because we would come under pressure, economic pressure from the US, and any intervention by our central bank to stabilize the currency and to stabilize the forex market will be closely watched by the US, and the country would be blamed as a currency manipulator. So it will restrict our monetary policy and forex policy options, and it could also affect the flow of investments and capital into our country. So essentially the US assumption is that if countries are deliberately trying to devalue their currency by frequently intervening in the forex market, by purchasing and selling dollars, if a country is seen to be artificially devaluing its currency, it would give that country a great advantage, because the exports of that country will become very competitive. It will become much cheaper in the US, and as a result, the exports from the country to US will see a significant jump. So US treats this as an unfair trade advantage, as according to the US, this is an artificial currency manipulation. It's a deliberate devaluation of the currency. US often accuses China, sometimes even India, of resorting to such artificial devaluation of their currencies. So those countries are placed on the currency monitoring list. So now the US has determined that after 2 years, India has shown progress. We don't meet that criteria anymore, and hence it has removed India from the list along with few other countries. So the advantage is that it will improve the market image of India. It will allow investors to see India as a major global market. It will also give more flexibility to our central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, to freely intervene in the currency market and in the forex market. Whenever there is a sudden appreciation or depreciation of the rupee, whenever there is a sudden inflow or outflow of dollars, the RBI can more freely step in to purchase or sell the dollars depending on the situation, the liquidity situation, and it can better strengthen the rupee, which protects India's trade interests. So this could be the advantage, as India would no longer be under the American pressure, as India was earlier placed on the currency monitoring list. So that is why the topic is important. It shows that India-US relations in the economic domain are growing, and it also shows that US is developing more trust on India with regard to their economic ties. Now coming to the fourth topic, we're going to talk about Nirav Modi's upcoming extradition to India. As many of you know, Nirav Modi is a wanted criminal in India. He has been designated as a fugitive economic offender who has fled the country. He has been charged under the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act that was passed recently, and he's accused of economic fraud, money laundering, and various other economic offences. He has been booked by the Enforcement Directorate and CBI, and both the law enforcement agencies are pursuing his arrest and extradition to India. So last week, the High Court in London rejected Nirav Modi's appeal against his extradition to India and in a way has cleared his extradition to India. So this brings India closer to get its hands on Nirav Modi, and most likely in the coming days, Nirav Modi might be extradited to India if approved by the UK government. Nirav Modi has been an economic offender along with his uncle Mehul Choksky, as they looted thousands of crore rupees from Punjab National Bank and diverted these loans through fraudulent activities into their personal accounts abroad. This involved money laundering and economic fraud being committed, and this was one of the biggest financial scams that was seen in India in recent times. Before they could be arrested in India, both Nirav Modi and Mehul Choksky, they fled India. They took shelter in foreign countries. Mehul Choksky has been hiding in Caribbean countries, in small Caribbean nations, whereas Nirav Modi fled to the United Kingdom. So India has labelled them as fugitive economic offenders under the recently passed Fugitive Economic Offenders Act, and we have been seeking their arrest, and the United Kingdom even cooperated with India. In fact, in 2019, Nirav Modi was arrested by the UK based on India's request. India had raised a legal request by following the due legal process, and under the India-UK extradition treaty, which has been signed, India reminded the UK that it has an obligation to extradite Nirav Modi after arresting him, as he is wanted in India for various criminal offences. So in 2019, he was arrested by the UK, and the UK government had initially approved his extradition. His extradition was initially cleared by the lower courts in UK as well. But later, Nirav Modi challenged it. He appealed against his extradition by citing his deteriorating mental health, by using his mental health as an excuse, and by citing possible human rights violations in India. He tried seeking a reprieve through UK's legal system. He claimed human rights protection under Article 3 of European Convention of Human Rights, to which UK has an obligation. He also claimed protection under the Extradition Act of the United Kingdom, which provides exception for people suffering from mental disorders. So Nirav Modi and his lawyers argued that he is suffering from serious mental condition, and if he is extradited to India, there could be possible human rights violations, as India's jail and prison conditions are known to be very atrocious. And he claimed that he could be pushed to the brink of committing suicide, which would be a violation of his human rights. But these claims of Nirav Modi have been dismissed by the UK court. The High Court in London has dismissed these arguments and has pointed out that India is a friendly foreign power to the UK government. And as per the obligations of India-UK extradition treaty, the court has asked the UK government to oblige with India's request and extradite Nirav Modi back to India. Because the Indian government has assured the court in UK that Nirav Modi would be provided adequate medical care and his human rights would be protected, as India itself is a democracy. So based on these assurances given by the Indian government, the UK court has cleared his extradition, and now one last step remains for his eventual extradition to India. According to the India-UK extradition treaty and according to the Extradition Act of the UK, India is an eligible country for extradition. But this requires approval from the respective law minister of UK. The cabinet rank minister in UK has to finally approve this extradition, following which Nirav Modi is likely to be extradited to India. So this marks a major win for India, and it highlights how economic offenders have been hiding in other countries and depriving India of its economic wealth. We have seen many cases in the recent past, including Vijay Mallya, Mehul Choksky, Lalit Modi, Nirav Modi and the others. So India has been pursuing these cases quite proactively, and if Nirav Modi is extradited, it will mark a major win for India, and it might encourage India to go after the other economic offenders as well. Now, coming to the last topic for today, we'll take a look at the African Sahel region, where there has been a big development. France has announced an end to its counter-terror military operations in the African Sahel. So here we need to understand what is the African Sahel region, where is it located, why was France involved here in military operations and counter-terror operations. Last week, the French government, that is French President Macron, has announced an end to Operation Barkhane, which was a French military counter-terror operation in the African Sahel. This counter-terror operation of France, it started way back in 2013. In 2014, it was named as Operation Barkhane, through which France had deployed around 4,000 to 5,000 elite special forces in various African countries in the Sahel region. I'll show you a map of Africa and I'll help you understand where the Sahel region is located. This can be very important for a map-based question for places in news, which is likely to be asked as map-based questions in prelims. Here you're looking at northern part of Africa. This is North Africa. The Saharan region over here. The Savannah belt over here. This is the Red Sea that marks the easternmost boundary of Africa, and this is the Atlantic Ocean, which marks the westernmost boundary of Africa. So between these regions, between Atlantic Ocean and Red Sea and North Africa and the Savannah grasslands, this is where the African Sahel region is located. It stretches over countries such as Senegal, parts of Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Sudan and Eritrea. In this region, there has been a sudden increase of extremism and radicalism. A number of terror outfits have been actively operating in these countries, especially in Mali, Mauritania, in Senegal and Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, Niger, and in Chad as well. Radical outfits also have a strong presence in Sudan and Eritrea. These terror outfits include notorious groups like Boko Haram, which have committed a lot of violations in Nigeria and Niger. There are many other terror groups which are affiliated with global terror organizations like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. These outfits, they are looking to liberate these regions and form a caliphate to enforce the Sharia law, and they have been engaged in violent terrorist and insurgent activities across these countries. Many of these countries in the Sahel, especially Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Senegal, they were all former French colonies. So France has a very close connection with these countries, and it also has a responsibility here to stabilize the region. Because many immigrants from here, they often enter France either through legal or illegal routes, and they end up becoming a burden on France as well. So further destabilization of the region due to terrorism and insurgency is seen as a threat for French interests. So to counter terrorism in this region, France deployed its troops and it started conducting counter-terrorism operations from 2013. In 2014, this operation was codenamed as Operation Barkhane, which was targeting Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State outfits across these countries that we spoke about. France was assisting the local governments, the respective governments, to fight against these extremist groups. But in the last few years, France has been facing several challenges in the military operation, and hence it has decided to end these counter-terror operations. It is going to pull out entirely from these military operations, and there are few reasons why France is doing this. The primary reason is many of these countries, that is Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea, they've all seen military coups in the recent past where military dictators have taken over the governments and they have caused a lot of human rights violations. And Mali had even thrown out the French ambassador after Mali extended military rule until 2025. So the relations of France with these countries under the military dictatorship has been very seriously affected, and these governments, they are no longer cooperating with France. So without the help of the local government and their armed forces, it would be very difficult for the French armed forces to conduct these operations. France also opposed any negotiation with these insurgent and terror outfits. The military dictatorship in Mali wanted to work out a peace deal with some of the extremist groups, but France was opposing it, as France is against any negotiation with terrorist organizations. This also became a major conflict between France and the military leadership in Mali. Along with this, the French military intervention has been largely perceived as a failure by these countries and by the local people. There has been rising anti-French sentiments across the African Sahel, and France fears that this could lead to more terror attacks against France as well. It could compromise French influence and French interests, as this military operation of France became very unpopular across the Sahel region. Finally, the last reason for France to pull out is a possible interference from Russia. Allegedly, Russia has been meddling in the region through a private military contractor group called the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is very closely linked with the Russian government and the Russian intelligence. It is owned by a private individual who is very close to President Putin. This private military group has been placed under economic sanctions as well by US and European countries. The Wagner Group has attracted a lot of controversy in Africa, in Ukraine as well, and also in West Asian conflicts, especially in Syria, where the military contractors and the mercenaries who are hired by these private military groups, they have been accused of committing large-scale human rights violations by aligning with the military dictatorships over here. Apparently, Russia has been meddling here to counter Western influence, as even US and UK have a presence in the Sahel region. They have been assisting France in their military and intelligence operations. So apparently, Russia has been interfering to the Wagner Group and fueling further insurgency and terrorism in order to fulfill its own interests against the Western governments. So Wagner Group has been accused by France of committing large-scale human rights violations here by aligning with these military dictatorships in the Sahel region. So this is also one of the likely reasons why France is pulling out, and hence it marks a very big development in the African Sahel. So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. We have covered 5 important topics that would be helpful for both prelims and mains. So I hope it was a fruitful discussion. Do let me know how the class went by commenting below. Also press the like button and don't forget to share the videos with other aspirants and do subscribe to the channel. So that is it from here. Thanks for watching. Good night.